and it's probably a good transition, is Putin's victory speech, even partially talked about in St. Petersburg. It's amazing. Here we are in America, everybody in the West, and if you wanted a realistic, objective, true realpolitik analysis of the world, the best place you can go is Vladimir Putin. I mean, because that speech laid out much better than any place what's been happening, what is happening, what they tried to do, what they failed to do, because he has a much more clear-eyed view than anybody in the West. Whereas, we have our people trained by one of the most prominent Yale historians of Russia affairs. This is who trains many of the members of the CIA, trains many members of the State Department, trains many members of the think tanks, has educated them, and his proteges educating them at other colleges, just like Stephen Kotkin in Princeton. You have them going out and saying things like the Yale historian saying that Russia's been busy kidnapping Ukrainians. Over 300,000 Ukrainians have been kidnapped from Russia and are now in detention camps in Russia. It's like, how do you say something so insanely false? And then you realize this guy taught the people that are actually making decisions in the State Department, actually making decisions at the think tanks. The reason why the West is where it's at is because we have idiots like that in America's academies making policy decisions directly or indirectly. And the reason why Russia is where it's at is because Putin is the most clear-eyed guy in the room as to what's really happening. You can like him, hate him, agree with him, disagree with him. He is still the most clear-eyed guy in the room by far. He understands it better than anybody.
Absolutely. Can I just say it was an extraordinary speech for a number of reasons. Firstly, it was incredibly structured. Secondly, and I don't know about you, Robert, but I have been a speech writer. I've written speeches for politicians, my aunt, for example. I can say definitely this speech is largely written by the man who delivered it. Putin wrote most of it. It's too much one person's voice, and the fact that it avoids rhetorical flourishes is again another sign that he's largely written by Putin himself. That's the second thing I'd say. And the third thing is it's extraordinarily measured and restrained and calm. Contrast that with the sort of hysteria that you get over here from all sorts of people. He doesn't bandy and throw around insults. He carries out cold, rational analysis, and it's an extraordinary contrast. And as you said, it shows, on the one hand, why he's winning, but it also shows that he knows that he is winning. So when you said that it was a victory speech, that essentially is what it was. He's extremely confident at this moment. And of course, at this moment in time, people in London, in Washington, I'm sure, as you probably tell us, in Brussels, certainly, are not confident. I, on the contrary, sense that they're beginning to panic because clearly the military situation in Ukraine, I don't think anybody now has any doubt about where it's going. I mean, you only had to look at the media coverage of the war over the last couple of days to see that there's now been this great sudden realization that no, Ukraine isn't going to win. Russia is winning. It's winning decisively. It's winning hands down. And it's no longer possible to either conceal that or pretend otherwise. That's one thing that's happening. But the second is that the economic war, the sanctions war, has turned out horribly. Now, you're probably slightly less exposed to that in the US than we are here in Britain and in Europe. But of course, here in Britain and in Europe, you can almost sense the hand-wringing now that's going on. How is this turning out the way it was? This wasn't what it was supposed to be like. We weren't, expecting that instead of the Russians, it would be we who were suffering. And what are we going to do? And you sent us to Alex and myself a extremely brilliant discussion of the three streams of opinion within the permanent government of the United States, the deep state, if you like, of the United States. And I was wondering if you could sort of broaden that out and share that with our viewers.
Brilliant. That was a brilliant.
It's brilliant. Yeah,
absolutely. If you could share that with everybody, Robert, that would be fantastic. Yeah, that was brilliant.
Definitely. Absolutely. To the earlier super chat question, I don't think Russia would offer anything for Julian Assange. That's just not inside of Putin's DNA. The fact he protected Snowden was just him protecting Snowden, but he wouldn't have gone out of his way to do that affirmatively. But it would be a great way for them to troll the West. You know, maybe offer the Brits. You send us Assange, we'll send you back those 2 Brits that are holding it, you know, just like that. Because Brit won't. I mean, you know, it'd be, if they want to troll them and draw attention, that'd be a great way to do it. And that'd be very, very Russian these days. I mean, they've become like master trolls and what the kind of stuff they're doing. They've been the press secretary, the press foreign affairs lady, and of course Lavrov, who's, you know, did it with the rest. But yeah,
Donetsk People's Republic Square.
Yeah, exactly. Right across from the U.S. Embassy. I mean, they're just doing. I mean, some of the people they put on their sanctions list were clearly ha ha ha. You know, they sat around laughing. It was like the old Cossacks when they were writing the famous letter to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and the famous painting that they're all, you know, the actual letter was crude as all get out, but it's in that spirit, and it's been just from a entertainment perspective, it's been fun to watch. And I do like watching Lavrov develop more aggressivity with Western media. Like that latest BBC one was him cross-examining the BBC reporter. And the BBC reporter not being cognizant of where his arguments go. But there's a deep, as you guys have been tracking, there's a deep divide within the deep state in America because you're seeing things that seem contradictory. One day it's almost like a day in the life of Zelensky, where one day he was reading off of this script, and the next minute he's reading off that script, and he doesn't realize the 2 scripts contradict each other because he's just busy reading off scripts. When he's not ready for Tropic Thunder 2 with Sean Penn and Ben Stiller, they were probably reviewing the screenplay for when they were over there, and this continuing embarrassment. I think these people don't know how the world looks at this, particularly a lot of the global South. I mean, you heard even Lula saying this is a crock, this is a joke. How these people are behaving. This is not how you behave in a war. This is, you know, I get when you grow up in reality TV, you apparently think you can just create your own TV show as a living president during a war and it will all work. And it's not. I mean, it would be great for Putin to try to trade for Assange. Now he would be doing it to troll, to be honest with you. But you know, why not have some fun? But the divide in the deep state is definitely real. It's in part because the Ukraine can't stay on script. Like, you know, the other day, Ukraine general came out and was like, this weapon sucks, that weapon sucks, 2 out of 5 this time. He doesn't realize you're part of a marketing campaign, bro. You're supposed to stay on message. But you have what you could loosely call the neoliberals, strongly present in the State Department, CIA, some of the intelligence branches, used to be really strong at the 7th floor of the FBI. That's their bureaucratic institutional source of power. They're globalist, but but their mindset is more Obama than it is Bush, and that's their strength. This goes all the way back to the Bush era, where, you know, Powell and his crowd were the most restrained on pursuing certain war policies than some of the others. But so that they are the most, in this context, though, irrational when it comes to Russia. George Soros affiliated NGOs have a lot of influence in this same sector. They're strongly aligned with the Brits. They're strongly aligned with the EU. These are the people that were very anti-Trump. They were part of both impeachment efforts, the Russiagate effort, et cetera. Like the 7th floor of the FBI, where they had a lot of allies, which mattered as they went after Trump. A lot of them got purged because of the mistakes of Spygate and Russiagate in inquiries. So they're not as strong there as they used to be. Though Merrick Garland was eager to say the DOJ's on their side by flying himself over to Ukraine and, you know, chatting up with the Ukrainian prosecutor. I wonder if he talked to them about why is Ukraine treating POWs as ordinary criminals and sentencing them to life. Apparently he didn't get around to that. Like the most egregious Geneva Convention violations have been taking place by the Ukrainians. There's issues with how Donetsk and Russia's handling this, but nowhere near as egregious as what Ukraine is doing. My guess is Merrick Garland didn't get around to that. For those that don't know around the world, Merrick Garland got his political name to fame by, for some of our perspectives, connected to the Oklahoma City bombing of 1995. He used that to go, whew. And there's some people that have questions about what he covered up in that process. There was something called Operation PatCon, an effort by the FBI after the end of the Cold War to create their own fake militias that may have blown back in what happened at Oklahoma City. Southern Poverty Law Center was running informants. There was race grifters out of a little town, in eastern Oklahoma, that were connected to like the Aryan groups that were organized out of the prisons that were doing robberies. I mean, it's a wild story. There's even an East German son of a high-ranking intelligence officer that shows up in the middle of the Oklahoma City story, who disappeared late at night. So it's like a dozen hush-hushes in one. I have a hush-hush about part of it there, but that gives an idea who Merrick Garland is. Garland didn't rise to fame by some, Elliot Ness-style investigations and inquiries when he was a federal prosecutor. People know him now as the guy who lost the U.S. Supreme Court bid when Scalia died. They know him as the D.C. Circuit Judge. They don't realize his real political background was being a very politicized prosecutor, managing law enforcement power so that only a certain narrative came out of certain events. So it's not a surprise that he's doing that way, but basically that's that wing. The neoliberal side, power in the State Department, power at the CIA, trained by the people I was talking about earlier, the Yale historians, the Princeton historians, the Ivy League historians. And if people in the West or people around the world want to understand how degraded our objective capability of analysis is, like Alexander was talking about yesterday, about that you have a lot of people in the school of realism in the U.S. government who are not realistic because they don't understand objectively the reality. It's because they don't employ strategic empathy. They're historically illiterate, and they're bad at functional economics and politics. And that's who our typical State Department person is. So that group, it's Russia must lose. That's it. End of story. There's no other alternative. Russia must lose. Russia must lose. Russia must lose. These are the people conjuring up, let's see if we can expand it to Transnistria. Let's see if we can expand it to Georgia. Let's see if we can expand it to the Black Sea. Let's see if we can expand it to Kaliningrad, trying to create second, third, and fourth fronts in this conflict. This is the group that won't give up. The CSIS recently did a little conference about this, and you can tell they're like still committed. We must go forward. We must go forward. We must go forward. These are the people, and they're waging a PR war because they are in trouble with the political class, and there's other parts of the deep state that don't agree with them. So that's where the State Department CIA types are in the middle, and they have strong allies at the Washington Post. That's their primary publication. They also have allies in the New York Times and institutional media and the rest, but the strongest is at the Washington Post. If you want to know what they're thinking, you can read the anonymous sources at the Washington Post. The next group is the Defense Department. And again, there's always exceptions and dissidents within each of these groups of the deep state, and there's people that are not aligned with the deep state in each of these institutions, but they have nowhere near dominant influence. The Defense Department, the reality is the dominant influence is the military-industrial complex. That, how do you fund war, right? You need the fear of war, but at some point to show off your weapons, you need actual wars. And, that's why there's always a war at some point in the world, all the time, right? So if one shuts down, another pops up because you got to advertise and sell these goods. You need to replenish, you need a new contract. So now for them, this was a huge windfall in everything. I mean, just massive money's being spent. Everything that gets emptied must in turn get replenished and refreshed. So it's an excuse. So even if they're emptying old weapon systems, there's going to be a demand to replace those with new weapon systems. So that's their goal. The problem for them in Ukraine is, what good is spending a lot of money on American trainers and NATO trainers and spending a lot of money on actual weapons if they just get their head handed to them, which appears to be what's happening militarily. What happens if your weapon system sucks so bad that Zelensky and the Ukrainian generals can't help but yip about it on national TV? There is such a thing as bad publicity when it comes to the military-industrial complex. The Javelin missile system has had a lot of bad publicity in this conflict. The other weapon systems have had, some of the drone fighting systems have had bad publicity, including the Turkish drones, American drones, other drones. Some of the tanks have, some of the missile systems have, some of the other systems have. And I mean, we just sent over some weapons. And aside from the Ukrainians taking the genius idea of let's take U.S. weapons and bomb residential neighborhoods in Donetsk, just humiliate Americans for sending that aid over in the first place. to commit war crimes using U.S. weapons. But the other thing, I mean, they keep saying 2 out of 5 break down, 3 out of 5 break down. They don't work after this point. They have this problem. They have that problem. So, and now what a lot of them don't realize is in Ukraine is they're there to help the weapons industry. The weapons industry ain't there to help them. They don't understand what the real deal is. They are a pretext to line the profits of the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about as, again, one of the greatest American generals. So it's not like he's anti-military in 1961 in his famous farewell address. So the concern in the Pentagon is they're about to get humiliated, that they're about to lose advertising value that's backfired on a whole bunch of weapon systems and on their own training. So they would like an exit ramp where they can pretend that their great training and their great weapon systems stopped Russia from taking over Ukraine. So just give them the South, give them a little bit of the East, let them keep that, and we'll pretend we won. Because it doesn't, I mean, it was the reason why they started off by saying Russia wanted to win in 72 hours, that they wanted Victory Day in Russia to be the day they've actually won all of Ukraine. They were setting up a ridiculous objective so they could say, see, we beat them, right? An old game. You say, oh, you want this. Actually, you don't want that, but I claim you do. So then when you don't get that, I say I beat you. So that was part of their goal. Almost all those ships have sailed now. And the problem is they're in a position where the U.S. military industry is going to look like a hollowed out post-Vietnam empty tiger that is not able or capable of actually supporting war against a major opponent on the ground. Mm-hmm. So that's why they want an exit ramp, a face-saving exit ramp. And they go back and forth on this. And this is why you're seeing a lot of debate about, are they winning? Are they losing? Like you see one piece one day about, oh, this is an inevitable disaster. They got to do territorial concessions. And the next day, Newsweek comes out saying Ukraine is really winning. They're just about to win. And don't listen to all this nonsense. That's the State Department side, right? So these people are arguing through the court of public opinion because they're arguing to the policymakers who are getting more and more nervous about what's happening. The big problem for the deep state's war on Russia is what you mentioned at the beginning, Alexander. Russia won. This was supposed to be a wipeout. I've said from the beginning, I don't think that we ever had a military or political strategy to win the war for Ukraine. We had an economic strategy that we thought that was the whole thing was provoke Russia to go into Ukraine, use that as a pretext to wage economic war against Russia, and prove that Kissinger's theory that if you control currencies, you control the globe is true. And to show the world, if you stick your head up, look what we did to Putin. We took him out, his country out, his economy out, his political structure out like that. So you better behave and keep your head low, whether you're some small country in Africa or you're Xi in China. Keep your head down and behave. What was not supposed to happen was Putin winning. That was, I guarantee you, never in their thought process. The people, the State Department, the Soros NGOs, they still can't understand it. And they just they're convincing themselves somehow this is just artificial and fake. And it's just about to fall apart. Just one more. It's like Afghanistan. We're just about to win, everybody. We're just about to win for every week for 20 years. So the problem is that failed. And Kissinger, there is also a broader debate between what you could call the Kissingers and what Putin called the kindergartners. So Putin's only kindergartners who haven't gone through primary school could believe these blaming me for the West self-imposed economic problems is on me. I would love to think I had that power, but I don't. There's a lot of that because it's these people trained by these bad Ivy Leaguers. Take Stephen Kotkin, right, at Princeton University. Lex Friedman promoted him as an important voice on the war on Russia. This is a guy who thinks that Stalin was really pretty much a nice guy, but the poor Ruskies made him crazy. I mean, that's his analysis for Russia. Leading Princeton Ivy Leaguer. And he thinks Stalin was a sweetheart, except for those mean Ruskies who turned him a little crazy. I mean, that is insanity. That's not history. That is insanity. Yet this is the leading guy teaching people at Princeton in the Ivy League. Mm. And that's, look at the CIA's roster. It was started at Yale. I mean, it's a long Ivy League roster of people. I got to meet James Woolsey there when I was a kid. He explained to me how we could still kill foreign leaders and assassinate them outside the assassination clause. He explained, Robert, This was live in the CIA at their cafeteria during a Yale Political Union event where he said, how do you define foreign leader? And I was like, he's like, so maybe we can assassinate them. Oh, okay. All right. Glad to know the CIA's reformed since MK Ultra and everything else. But the Treasury Department realizes they lost. Kissinger, the kindergartners are strong in the State Department. Some are at the Defense Department, weaker at the Treasury Department. The Kissinger types, in reverse from his own personal past, are strongest in the Treasury Department, decent in the Defense Department, weak in the State Department. And what I mean by Kissingers is that they're just more capable of being realist, more capable of realpolitik analysis. Believe in it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're skilled at it, because there's still a fundamental flaw. And there's not many Mearsheimers in actual positions of power, is what it boils down to. There's not many Kaplans. There's very few of those guys. They're the older generation, and most of them are gone. But those that do exist are strong in the Treasury Department. And this is where the Wall Street financial banking elite, that side of the deep state's institutional influence, is strongest at the Treasury and the Fed. It's not a coincidence that Biden did not consult the Fed before he announced the sanctions. It's not a coincidence that Jamie Dimon, head of Chase Bank, came out and said, are we sure this is such a great idea? Because these are people some of these were people who were skeptical from the get-go. They didn't think it was worth the risk of dollar dominance, of global economic control, of supply chain interruption to issue sanctions against Russia, because they feared the consequence would be divestment by the East from the West. If you're wealthy or powerful, why do you still have money or property in the West? They just proved they'll go and take it anytime they want. I mean, they're doing it to Abramovich, a guy who's not even that pro-Putin. They took away his soccer club. They took away his yachts. Now they're seizing his planes here in America. And doing so even though he doesn't legally own them, he owns them indirectly. And they're expanding the sanctions to grab anything. People like Jamie Dimon were like, this might not be so good for our investment environment. Then you had people worried about the dollar dominance. They're like, what happens if the world realizes they shouldn't have the dollar? That for those who want global bank-backed digital currencies, will anybody be on board for that when they see how easily you use that to strip them of their assets, to strip them of their wealth, to really strip them, as Putin put it, of their sovereignty? So there were concerns voiced, but they were suppressed by Janet Yellen and the rest, who were convinced this would work on Russia. When it didn't, Kissinger was for him to go over to the World Economic Forum at Davos and tell them, time to exit, time to exit. This was his realization. This had failed. And before we go off a Kabul-sized cliff, we need to get out now. That pressure continues to escalate because of domestic U.S. economic problems, which they're just as bad in Europe, worse actually in parts of Europe. But you look at what's happening in the U.S., we have inflation out of control at the highest rate in 40 years. And if you want to see what real inflation looks like, go to a place called Shadow Stats. They use the old inflation metrics we used to have and just tell you what they would be if we were using the same metrics in the 1970s. And that puts our inflation at 15 to 16%. So that's problem one. And the problem two is there's been this mythology that Paul Volcker cured inflation with interest rate rises. There's Jeff Snyder, a lot of independent economic analysts that say that isn't actually what happened. And that a lot of other things happen. And the Volcker myth is kind of dangerous because it convinced the Fed they could get out of any economic problem. Right now, the Fed is trying to do that. But the problem is, as they raise interest rates, they're sinking the housing market, they're sinking the stock market, but they're not sinking inflation. So these two markets we've used in a consumer-driven American economy to keep things afloat almost artificially, especially during the lockdown when we printed a ridiculous amount of money, which was Putin's primary point economically, is maybe you printing all this money has something to do with the money supply value going down and inflation. Just maybe when you print 40 trillion, it has a problem. And so you look at that dynamic in the States, and there's even more pressure to end the conflict from the Treasury side. They can't, the supply chain interruptions, the inflationary increases, like we get more of it indirectly in the United States, but we still get it. When there's supply chain issues in Europe, there'll be supply chain issues ultimately in America. When there are cost issues that are changing global markets, that will come back on the United States. And, Biden attempting to say, hey, it's the greedy oil company's fault, won't sell because of his own policies. You can't say it's the Putin price hike 1 minute and say it's the Exxon price hike the next minute. Which is it? Come up with a story and stick with it. The reality is his war on oil, war on fossil fuels, just like Sri Lanka just discovered, trying to institute ESG policies can lead to a famine, as that country is about to do. Climate change policies on this scale are simply not sustainable in the current environment. And you add to that what the sanctions have done, on top of all the insanity of what we printed in the lockdown, and the Treasury Department realizes they may not be able to get us out of this situation. So what they don't want is continued escalation with Russia. What they don't want is spending billions and billions and billions more on Ukraine. They want out. And for Kissinger to go to Davos to preach that showed you how significant that constituency is to go public. And so that's where the deep state divide is. Treasury wants out now, that part of the deep state. The Defense Department wants an exit ramp. And the State Department says this is do or die. We must win now. We cannot ever give up. We cannot ever quit. This is Hitler. This is 1942. We must march onward. And it's going to be interesting watching this. And you'll see it on the front pages of major magazines, major papers, people arguing on TV, because but ultimately Treasury tends to win. So I haven't read that book. That's interesting. I'll take a look at that. After the Empire. But yeah, so that's where we're at. We feel like a dying, decaying empire. We feel like the old colonial governments that got too out of touch in their local communities or constituencies. But it is a real political brawl. And Biden, we have a dementia candidate in the middle of it, So he's busy reading off scripts, not sure which script he's supposed to read on a given day. I mean, the guy literally cannot walk up the stairs without falling down, cannot ride a bike without falling down. We are in a new state of disgrace. I sent Alex what he said yesterday, which is him saying, you could sum up America in one word. And he was like, it's like, oh, my God. This is a bad Monty Python skit.
That's coming in a video tomorrow. That's going to open everything.
It was just classic. So, yeah, but the deep state divide is real here. Hopefully the saner side, I never thought I would say I hope the Kissingerites win, but in this context, I actually do, because we need to get out of this. Not figure out a way to, maybe we could wage nuclear war over Kaliningrad. I mean, these people are insane.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Can I just say that, we're talking about realism. One of the features of a realist is that you're realistic about yourself, about your own limits. And of course, this is something that Putin has and the Russians do. I mean, they're not got illusions that they can do anything, that they have enormous powers that are beyond what they actually do. And I just want to read one paragraph which he gave at this speech, at the speech, when he says, it would even be nice to hear that we are so powerful and omnipotent that we can blow up inflation in the West, in the United States and Europe, or that we can do things to throw everything into disorder. Maybe it would be nice to feel this power if only there were truth in it. The situation has been brewing for years, spurred by the short-sighted actions of those who are used to solving their problems at somebody else's expense, and who have relied and still rely on the mechanism of financial emission to outbid and draw trade flows that's escalating deficits and provoking humanitarian disasters in certain regions of the world. I would add, this is essentially the same predatory colonial policy as in the past. So it's not us. We don't have that kind of power. We're not single-handedly creating inflation. We're not imploding the United States. We don't have the ability to do those things. It's the United States, its leaders who've been doing that by themselves. We are bystanders in this. We're even to some extent victims of it, because being part of the world as well, we have been negatively affected by these policies. Now, that is actual realism. It's so different from what you get in the West, where, we go around, we brag, we say that, we've achieved all kinds of things. We're achieving all this. We're winning here. We're winning there. We're always taking credit for things that we don't necessarily do. And that is not realistic. That is delusional. It is extremely dangerous. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about this. Now, I think the problem is that the Kissinger wing, the Treasury wing, I think they will win out. The question is time. How soon can they win? Because events on the ground in Ukraine are now moving at their own pace. We've been getting information over the last couple of days, in fact, even the last couple of hours, which suggests a military crisis for Ukraine developing in Donbass. And at the same time, as you rightly said, the economic situation is increasingly getting out of control. We now have inflation rising, and you're absolutely right, by the way. Inflation is not something you can simply control through interest rates. You can't just increase interest rates by 5% and bring down inflation. I mean, it's stupid to think this. Far too many people think this. If you're going to bring down inflation, you have to coordinate right across every single policy tool and focus on doing that and look at all the various other problems that you're creating and prioritize bringing down inflation, and then you can do it. So that's obviously right. But so we have inflation, we have an industrial economic crisis, especially in Europe, where we're running out of essential materials, we're running out of energy, we're running out of food. I showed some time ago to Alex, just a few days ago, pictures of a food bank in London, 50 seconds away from my house, 50 seconds by foot. And this is a very affluent part of London. You don't normally expect to see sites like that here. This is a food bank with a long, long queue of people stretching into the distance trying to get food. We have strikes now in London, in Britain, railway strikes, teachers' strikes. There's strikes apparently pending in the airlines. Lawyers, believe it or not, you may be interested to learn, Robert, are also talking about going on strike. These are the ones who make their money through the government's legal aid system, which is something you don't have in the United States. It's a government-run funds to provide money for people who have find themselves in the criminal courts. Anyway, those lawyers are going on strike, and workers right across, not just the public sector now. There's even talk that we might start getting strikes in the private sector as well. So we are in a bad situation in Britain. I'm getting news that in Germany things are going badly wrong there as well. That something like a fifth of companies in Germany are now facing closure because of the escalating energy costs. There's been appalling information coming on the inflation situation in Germany, that underlying inflation is now rising, skyrocketing upwards. We have a government in Germany that is weak and divided and doesn't know what to do, and is still very much under the control of the Green Party, which is essentially allied with the people that you spoke about in the State Department. I mean, they basically are in the same bed together. All of this is coming together at phenomenal speed. So Kissinger at Davos spoke about a 2-month window. The point is, he said that, I think, 3 weeks ago. He was probably right, but that window is closing. What are we going to do? What are we going to do in that time that's left to rescue us from this debacle that we are seeing? And Janet Yellen, she's coming up with some extraordinary ideas. She says that we control oil prices, we put a cap on energy prices all around the world, we put tariffs, global tariffs on the price of Russian oil, So we basically telling, the Indians, if you want to buy Russian oil, you're only allowed to do it at this kind of price. How are you ever going to enforce anything like that? So I take the point that, Treasury eventually wins, but perhaps they don't have as much time as they think they have. And certainly they don't have the time, or so it seems to me, to rescue this administration. This is shaping up to be an almighty debacle. And I think that by November, that will be so visible that it will no longer be possible to argue any way around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like what the shared nightmare of all attributes of the deep state in the West, or the U.S. and its allies, which right now apparently is stronger still at the MI6 and the British crowd, and particularly the War Department / State Department equivalent in the UK, as Boris Johnson runs over to make sure that Zelensky doesn't do a deal every time Zelensky is told to do a deal by the rest of continental Europe that doesn't want to end up looking like 1930s economics all over again. I mean, heck, that's why there's a reason why Hitler was heading to the Caucasus. He wasn't just invading Russia. He was heading to because he needed the oil. Had to get the oil fast. And the Germans are back to we'll just cut ourselves off from the Russian oil. See how that worked. That was a different approach. They could collapse a little quicker, a little sooner. So but I think their shared nightmare is New Year's party in Odessa with Vladimir Putin standing up celebrating the new Novorossiya. That is their shared nightmare. And the State Department is deluding itself into believing that it can prevent that by just continuing to escalate. The Defense Department goes, 1 minute there's, we just have a new weapons game changer, whichever lobbyist they talk to last, to just send in 100 of these and then that will change everything. But please don't use them in the wrong way. Right? We were on with Armchair Warlord, a guy that's been a military guy for about 10 years, recently left, now is in law school. And he was talking about there's a reason why even, during certain conflicts in the Mideast, we didn't send them Stinger missiles because we were terrified that, some terrorist was going to take down a plane with a U.S. Stinger. And now we're sending all kinds of weapons into Ukraine and admitting we have no idea where they end up. So the Defense Department goes back and forth on different days. And as you note, Yellen, is trying to play the game of what the State Department crowd wants. But almost everybody in the banking financial world is screaming exit, 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 exit. And so you're seeing this constant conflation and confrontation between these different sources because they all fear the same thing. And some just are a little more clear-eyed at knowing when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen and if it's going to happen than others within our own apparatus. And as you note, it's a bad lack of the capacity of objective. I mean, what realism requires is old school Burkean conservatism, a respect on limits, an understanding of your own limits, and an understanding of others' limits. We don't have much of that. There are very few Mearsheimers. Somebody asked in the super chat earlier about the Mearsheimer debate. I mean, McFaul is an idiot. Just follow him on Twitter. The guy's a joke. The fact that we had him as an ambassador to Russia should tell you everything you need to know about how degraded our intellectual political class is. It's just degraded. It's kind of like the Ukrainian military in the Donbass. It's just there's not a lot left that you can have confidence in. And so that's going to continue on that front. But politically, you're right. I don't see any exit for them. They thought maybe January 6th, doing these big televised hearings in the United States on January 6th. And even NBC News was tracking independent Republican sort of anti-Trump voters in outside of Reno in Nevada. And what they found was the more they talked about January 6th, the more Republican support went up, not down, but up. Because people are reminded of how nonsense it is that they're being focused on. Putin has brought up January 6th, I think, a half dozen times himself. He's like, whenever people bring up different things on Russia, he's like, well, there was a country where a bunch of people were politically rebelling, tried to voice protest inside a government building, and you've locked them all up and dropped them in a hole without even a trial for years. That's the United States of America. That's who did that. with January 6 cases. So when people see that January 6 isn't going to save them, now even gun control won't really save them because of the Supreme Court decision. They think Roe's reversal might help them. I think they'll find out otherwise. If you look at what's happened just a couple of weeks ago in West Texas, an 86% Mexican-American congressional district voted for a Republican. This was Trump made massive inroads in Latino voters in the United States. And as Van Jones even noted recently, he knows no friend of his that calls themselves Latinx, right? That makes, that's the woke world. They're in this sort of fake world. They're worried about pronouns at the Pentagon. Worry about military weapons that actually work. Worry about that. Worry about accurate military strategy, not pronouns. But the fact that a Republican won that district, where even though Trump made inroads, Biden still won it by a solid margin, gives a sense for what's happening in the country. Two things are happening: massive shift against the Democratic leadership. It's really, in my view, a rejection of neoliberalism, period. That Obama just postponed that because he was personally likable. So because he was so personally likable, largely due to media inflated versions of him, because the guy's an arrogant, condescending prick. But the ordinary American thought, also America wanted to get past its racial history, and Obama personified that. But if you looked at his policies, they were never popular. And what's happening is Biden is a guy that cannot mask the unpopularity of neoliberalism, especially on display. And there's, as the comedian used to say, there's nothing worse than the Republican Party and the Democratic Party getting together. That's when you're really going to get screwed. There's nothing worse than the neocons and the neoliberals getting together. And that's what's happened under the Biden administration, best personified in the State Department with Victoria Nuland's continued resurgent presence. And Ukraine has been their baby. It's been some of the Soros NGO babies for 30 years. So people are so invested. And we're going to use Ukraine to overturn Russia, to overturn Putin, to restore it to its colonial days of the 1990s. They wouldn't call it that. They'd call it the liberal democratic days, but that's what it really was. And they can't give up on it. And even though domestically they're about to get crushed in November. You look like the turnout between the Republicans and Democrats in these primaries is predicting a unprecedented Republican win. 50 to 75 seats in the House. 5 or more seats in the Senate. Now, Republicans are really good, and Jacob Drazen likes to put it this way, and this is a classic sort of old school populist base viewpoint in America, which is the Democratic Party is the crazy party, the Republican Party is the stupid party. So that viewpoint is a commonly held view in certain parts. So you can't rule out Republicans burning themselves up. But I think that the Democrats are done. They're DOA. It's kind of like Lyndon Johnson's version of the Democratic Party in 1968 was finished. And, Nixon and Watergate just postponed that. And it really, neoliberalism didn't resurface and resurge until Clinton in 1992. And even then it was disguised as something it wasn't. Clinton's disguised as some form of Southern populism, border state populism. Obama disguised as, the biracial guy that just has a sweet family that just wants to do things the best for the people. But the underlying policies were never popular and still aren't. And to the question as to Trump or DeSantis in 2024, DeSantis has told people close to him he will not run if Trump runs. So unless Trump falls apart, we will have right now we'll have a Republican House, Republican Senate by 2023, and we'll have all three with a Trump White House in 2025. As I've told people, the other aspect of DeSantis is he's indictment insurance for Trump, so that he is someone who Democrats would rather face Trump than DeSantis, is their view. So that means they'll talk big in the January 6th committees about Trump, won't actually indict him. But that's basically where we're heading. We're heading towards a Republican sweep in 2022, and I don't see anything reversing that. The Ukraine war continues to be more politically unpopular in the country. The people that are anti-war continue to surge for the most part in various primaries and polls. And that's the reason why there's this big PR fight by the deep state. The existing established political folks, as well as the incoming folks, are thinking this turned out to be kind of a disaster. This this whole Ukraine thing, it ain't quite going the way it's supposed to go, and they don't want to continue. They don't want to be on the Afghanistan, Iraq version of I mean, and especially you look at U.S. foreign policy military power since the end of the Cold War. Korean War mostly failed, and you can argue partially successful, but we weren't able to go into North Korea. That's because of the China, but thankfully Doug MacArthur's idea to nuke them didn't go through. People forget about old Dougie. But the Vietnam War failed. You can argue about the first Iraq War, second Iraq War, definitely a failure. Syria failure, Libya failure, Sudan failure, Somalia failure, Afghanistan failure, and now the pet project for 30 years of Ukraine and the anti-Russia project failure. So bad that there's Putin in front of 80% of people representing 80% of the world's population, 80% of the world's food, 80% of the world's fuel, 80% of the world's professional soldiers, all giving him a applause for his effective victory speech about all of this. And it's ironic that we had to rely on the Ruskies to limit the effect of some of the Vander crazies of the globalists.